Guns in America, Part 2 on today, Contemporary Issue Wednesday. Alright guys, so last week I talked to you a little bit about the context for why so many people in America are passionate about gun ownership, gun rights. Again, it stems from constitutional rights, it stems from cultural history and guns being an intimate part of that, and ultimately it comes down to citizens being able to resist an oppressive government. Today I want to get into a few of the little nitty-gritty arguments between gun rights advocates and between gun control advocates. Now, obviously, I can't get into all the myriad, the thousands of different arguments. Would take way too long. You'd get bored, I'd get bored, and then we'd want to have to take out our guns and use them ourselves. Before we get to the two arguments that we are going to talk about here, let me just throw out a few different arguments on different sides of the spectrum that you'll hear. I'll just throw them out, flag them, I won't cover them in detail. So people who argue for gun rights ownership will say things like, if you go to different cities around the US that have the strictest gun control, you'll find the most gun violence, like Chicago, for instance. People will argue, we want protection. We want protection for ourselves, for our family, for our property, for our God-given, inalienable constitutional right to own weapons. They'll say things like, if you make guns illegal or you ban guns, the very fact that criminals who are violating the law will get guns anyway. A legal barrier between people and weapons doesn't really make sense if criminals are the ones who are actually using the guns. People who argue for more gun control say, well, it's just common sense. We should have very, very strict procedures, strict standards for people who want to buy weapons that are specifically designed to kill or maim people or animals. People will say things like, look, the right to bear arms was in the context of militias in the Second Amendment. We don't need militias anymore because we're a unified country. We don't have states warring against different states within the United States. And so because we don't need militias, we don't need rights to assault weapons. So there are just some of the very, very numerous arguments that people make on different sides of the gun rights spectrum. So what I want to focus on are two issues that I think are the most important and are also easiest to change right now through legislation, through simple legislation, if you believe that they should be changed. If you don't believe they should be changed, and I'm not saying I agree or disagree, then you just do nothing. You keep the status quo. And so the two issues that I think are most important when it comes to gun rights, gun ownership, gun control is assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. So what do I mean by assault weapons? Assault weapons are basically semi-automatic or automatic weapons that have releasable magazines that are very powerful. Now, it's important to state before we go any further that because the United States is made up of 50 different states, each individual state will have a specific stance on assault weapons, on high-capacity magazines, on any gun range issue. And so, if you go to a different state, depending on which state you're in, some states like California, assault weapons will be banned. Some states like North Carolina, assault weapons will not be banned. So it does depend on which state you are in to a certain extent. Congress can mandate a nationwide ban on assault weapons, and they did in the 1990s, but as it stands now, there's a lot of differentiation between the different states. And so people who argue against the right for people to own assault weapons is they say, hey, look, first things first, assault weapons were specifically designed as weapons of warfare. They're not weapons of self-defense, they're weapons of offensive warfare. Secondly, alongside this, they say, hey, look, what do you need this for self-defense? Isn't a pistol or two pistols with 5 or 6 shots each in them, isn't that enough for self-defense? Why would you need, an AK-47 with 30 rounds? That's a little bit of an overkill as far as defense is concerned. And moreover, if you're outside of your property, you're obviously not walking around with like an AR-15 strapped to your back as you're walking through the grocery store. So what's the point? The last argument I'll say here that people who argue against assault weapons as being legal, they would say that because you don't need assault weapons for defense, the risks of actually legalizing assault weapons is too high comparative to what you actually get. I.e., you can get self-defense from non-assault weapons, and so we should stick to that and not make assault weapons legal, because if you make assault weapons legal, you don't get that much more of a benefit in self-defense, but what you do is you up the risk that people will use assault weapons as offensive weapons to kill people, murder people. What do people who argue for legalization of assault weapons say? Well, the first thing they always say is self-defense, right? They say there is an argument to be made that I am much much more safe. I have a better ability to protect myself, my family, my property if I have a 30-round semi-automatic AR-15 than if I have a 5-shot pistol. The second thing they'll say is citizens have the right to have assault weapons because if they are attacked from their government or their government is rendered immobilized because of a nuclear disaster or invasion, the last line of defense from either our own government or a government that's invading is individual citizens. And if individual citizens are allowed to have assault weapons, they can better defend themselves and their country. All right, so those are the arguments for and against assault weapons use. So let's move on to high-capacity magazines. Now, high-capacity magazines, for our sakes here, is any retractable magazine that can have 10 or more rounds of ammunition. So why is this important? Well, the more rounds that you can have in your cartridge or your magazine, the more rounds that you can shoot off in your gun without reloading, gives you that much more offensive capability, that much more potential to be a lethal threat. And if you look at some of the mass shootings in recent history around the United States, like Virginia Tech is a good example, magazine capacities in these mass shootings were very high. And the argument goes, look, if you reduce the amount of magazine capacity, you would reduce the risk or the potential for offensive capability. And so the argument against high-capacity magazines is a similar argument to assault rifle bans, and that's saying that the defensive aspects, the defensive benefits that I gain do not outweigh the offensive potential that it confers or potentially confers to someone who wants to commit a mass shooting or a murder. That is, the abilities that I gain to defend myself from having a magazine of 20 bullets instead of 8 bullets is not enough to justify giving someone who wants to potentially murder an individual or individuals or a group discriminately or indiscriminately. And again, the same arguments that people would use who want to keep the ability to have high capacity magazines would be, again, self-defense. They'll say, hey, I have a better shot of defending myself. And they'll say that that ability to defend myself is actually worth the risk of an offensive capability to shoot and murder people. They'll also say again, hey, look, we're the last line of defense. Having a high-capacity magazine gives us a better opportunity to resist a government. So those are the two biggest issues I think Americans need to come to terms with. What do they think about assault weapons? What do they think about high-capacity magazines? The last thing I want to say about this whole guns rights issue in the United States of America is this. The hardest part about designing, implementing policy when it comes to gun ownership and gun control is this issue of causation. What policies actually cause the type of things we want to see happen? And so many of the arguments that people make on both sides of the spectrum here revolve around this issue of causation, right? So people who advocate for gun control say, hey, look, if we restrict access to guns, there will be less gun violence. That restricted access will cause restricted gun violence. And people who say, no, we should give everyone the right to gun ownership because we think it'll increase self-defense, we think it'll increase people's ability to police their own neighborhoods. They'll say that increasing people's access to guns will cause less gun violence. And this issue of causation is very, very, very difficult because reducing one thing or restricting another thing or giving access to something, just that one factor alone doesn't mean that you can necessarily draw a direct causation between that policy and reduced gun violence. So for instance, people will say things like, in the mid-1980s, California banned assault weapons. Let's say that that's one of the arguments they'll use. Immediately after this restriction, for the next few years, gun violence actually went up in California. And so guns rights advocates will point to that and they'll say, hey, look, you put in an assault weapons ban, and what happened was the exact opposite of what your intention was. Gun violence went up when you banned assault weapons. But there are so many other factors at play that might be contributing to violence in California. Issues like the economy. What if there was a massive recession and people were now much more homeless and much more prone to violent crime? What about gang issues and dynamics between intra-gang dynamics and inter-gang dynamics between gangs and within gangs? Maybe the drug trade coming across Mexico was increased 400% during that time. So there's all these different other factors that can come into play and actually have a causal effect about what is actually causing the increase in gun violence. That's probably the hardest thing to nail down in these debates is causation. What is actually working? And does this work universally apply? applied? Will the same policy that works in Southern California work in the hills of East Tennessee and vice versa? And so you've got issues of causation and you've got issues of universal applicability. And so that's what I want to leave you guys with. What do you think about all these gun rights and gun control issues? If you're not from America in particular, I want to hear your view. What do you think about this argument that citizens should be armed with assault rifles and high-capacity magazines in order to protect themselves and in order to resist their government? Are you buying this argument? Are you not buying this argument? Comment below, let me know, share the video, subscribe to the channel, and remember guys, reality always trumps ideology.